Inspector Purbright, a web of lies and secrets, his most puzzling case. Yet, BBC radio drama. The luncheon had been planned with the kind of civic enthusiasm that always masked an undercurrent of competition. A long trestle table gleamed under the strained light of the town hall's ceiling lamps, set with sandwiches of varying commitment, a few proud cakes, and a rather apologetic quiche that nobody claimed to have baked. Mayor Beatrice Ordway presided, her chain of office polished to within an inch of its life. She was determined, as she confided to no one, that today's luncheon would display not merely the culinary skills of Flaxborough's better families, but the smooth efficiency of its municipal governance. The new development scheme, a shopping arcade designed to modernize the riverside, was the reason for all this cheer. Or so the speeches insisted. Inspector Purbright, seated 2 chairs away from the mayor, accepted a plate of sponge cake with the mild resignation of a man long resigned to public catering. He had, over the years, acquired the reputation of being inscrutable. Today, he merely appeared mildly interested in the speeches while quietly noting who avoided whose gaze. At precisely 2 o'clock, a young clerk wheeled in a display case. Within it lay the town's original charter, its parchment yellowed and its ink faded but legible. Mayor Ordway announced with great solemnity that this charter represented Flaxborough's noble heritage and would, for the duration of the development consultations, be on display for public reassurance. Polite applause followed. A few guests craned their necks, squinting through the glass. The applause had barely died when an awkward hush fell. The charter, so carefully introduced, was no longer there. For a moment, no one moved. The empty display case glimmered with guilty innocence beneath the lights. Perhaps, began Councillor Hardwick, too quickly, it was mislaid. His voice was calm, but his hands were not. Several heads turned, some in disbelief, others in delight at this unforeseen entertainment. Mayor Ordway's smile faltered. Mislaid? She repeated.
A document housed in a locked case?
It may be in the clerk's office, suggested Mrs. Tither, whose presence was always accompanied by the faint scent of varnish and secrets. Things are so easily misfiled. Purbright said nothing. His eyes followed the young clerk, now pale and trembling, as he stammered out that he had left the charter in place less than an hour ago. The room buzzed with low, excited speculation. To misplace a teapot was ordinary. To misplace the town's very foundation was unprecedented. As the mayor attempted to restore order, Purbright's gaze drifted beyond the crowd to a side door, ajar by the merest fraction. It was a small observation, easily overlooked. He filed it away without comment. When, minutes later, a search of the surrounding rooms turned up nothing, the event's tone shifted. What had been a luncheon became an inquest in miniature. Questions flew like startled pigeons. Who last saw the charter? Who had keys to the case? Who stood nearest the display when the mayor spoke? By the time tea was served, the missing charter had acquired a life of its own. Some whispered of political sabotage, others of plain incompetence. One or two muttered about curses. Purbright, finishing his tea, merely remarked, "Curious how a thing can vanish more completely when many eyes are upon it." No one quite knew what he meant, but it gave them something new to discuss as the luncheon dissolved into restless groups. As the townsfolk departed, the inspector lingered by the display case. There were no fingerprints, no scratches, no sign of forced entry. Only a faint smudge of ink on the glass edge, out of place and, for now, unexplained. He straightened, hands clasped behind his back, and allowed himself a faint, unreadable smile. This was no ordinary misplacement. Somewhere among these polite faces, someone had very quietly rewritten the town's history, and Purbright intended to read between the lines. By the following morning, the missing charter had ceased to be merely an administrative embarrassment and had blossomed into a fully fledged scandal. Though one decorated with ribbons of imagination and embroidered with personal grudges. It was remarkable how swiftly fact evaporated once it left the town hall, to be replaced by that rich and fragrant commodity Flaxborough produced in inexhaustible quantity: gossip. At the Grapes Inn, where most local truths were carefully distilled before public consumption, the talk over breakfast pints had already settled into distinct factions. Councillor Hardwick's name was spoken with increasing relish by a group of men whose mistrust of elected officials was matched only by their enthusiasm for impugning them. "Mark my words," declared Mr. Digby, the ironmonger, stabbing his sausage for emphasis. "Hardwick's up to his waistcoat in it, always talking about heritage and public trust. But he's the sort would sell the town's own mother if it kept his name on a plaque." This judgment was received with the approving grunts of men who had never much cared for plaques. In another corner, two retired schoolteachers were convinced that the culprit could only be one of the young clerks. Ambitious, careless creatures who spent more time on their hair than on safeguarding documents. They cited the pale and trembling young man from the previous afternoon as proof.
"You saw him," one whispered dramatically. "He looked ready to faint."
Either nerves or guilt, probably both. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice Tither, having opened her antiques shop a little later than usual, was busily confiding to her most credulous customers that the theft had been executed with professional precision. She leaned forward conspiratorially across her glass counter, lowering her voice until it was just above a hiss. No ordinary thief, you see. Oh no. This was someone who knew the value of what they were taking. Knew it down to the last curl of ink. I wouldn't be surprised if it's already on its way to London. These things disappear into private collections, you know. Very hush-hush, the customers, suitably impressed, departed with their purchases and a renewed conviction that Flaxborough was harbouring at least one criminal mastermind. Mrs. Tither, for her part, locked the till with a flourish and congratulated herself on another morning's work of shaping opinion. By mid-afternoon, even those who had not been present at the luncheon were repeating detailed accounts of how the theft had been carried out. According to Mrs. Cowper, whose son's wife's cousin knew a clerk at the town hall, the charter had been cut neatly from its frame with a blade so fine it could have been surgical. According to Mr. Fordyce, whose expertise in all matters was universally acknowledged by himself, the thief had simply rolled the parchment into a cylinder and walked out with it under an arm. "Bold as brass!" Inspector Purbright, moving quietly through the town like a mild draught of air that stirred but did not disturb, noted each version without comment. He had spent the morning at his desk drafting an entirely unrelated report, but his ears had been busy. When, late in the day, Sergeant Malley came bustling in with a face flushed from equal parts cold wind and excitement, Purbright greeted him with the same calm politeness he might have shown to a man delivering a library book. "It's all but settled, sir," Malley announced, thumping his notebook down.
"Tom Larch, the handyman."
"Been seen near the mayor's office that very morning, and he's up to his ears in debts.
Owes half the town from what I hear."
It fits perfectly. Purbright looked mildly surprised, though whether at the accusation or the sergeant's certainty was impossible to tell. "Indeed," he said. "A man in debt is often suspected of theft. It saves the trouble of searching for motives more subtle." Malley frowned, uncertain if he was being gently rebuked. "Well, there's more. Larch's neighbour swears he saw him sneaking home with a rolled-up bundle under his coat last night." "Did he now?" Purbright folded his hands. "And what did this bundle contain?" "That's just it, sir. He didn't get a proper look. But he said it looked important." "Important," Purbright echoed. "A most useful adjective. Covers everything from a court summons to a baguette." The sergeant, who had learned not to press these conversational digressions, contented himself with muttering about the usual sort of fellow and went to make tea. Left alone, Purbright considered Tom Larch a likeable man generally, slow to anger, quick to lend a hand, though never entirely free of the faint air of someone who had just misplaced something valuable. Debts, yes, but who in Flaxborough was free of those? It was a small town. One did not need to steal a charter to be quietly ruined. In the evening, as the last light slanted across the river, Purbright walked the length of High Street, stopping now and then to exchange pleasantries. He was greeted everywhere with the kind of nervous eagerness that comes when people suspect the inspector may already know their secrets. Some offered unsolicited theories. A butcher confided that Mrs. Tither was not to be trusted, as she once sold him a chair that turned out to have only 3 sturdy legs. A postman hinted darkly at Councillor Hardwicke's late-night comings and goings. Purbright listened, nodded, and moved on, filing each remark alongside the rest. He was less interested in what was said than in how it was said. The quick glance away, the tremor of amusement in a voice, the defensiveness that arrived too early. At dusk he paused outside the mayor's office. The building looked perfectly ordinary now, its windows reflecting the fading sky. Yet Purbright felt the same small current of unease he had noticed when the charter first vanished. Inside those walls someone had done something very deliberate and very quiet. Across the street, a shadow shifted. Tom Larch emerged from an alley, cap pulled low, and hurried past without seeing the inspector. Purbright's eyes followed him, unreadable. Later, back at his office, Sergeant Malley returned with more tidings. "Mrs. Tither's been talking again, sir. Claims this theft's connected to some old scandal about land rights. Says certain councillors stand to gain a fortune if the original charter disappears." "Ah," Purbright murmured, pouring tea. "And does Mrs. Tither know which councillors?" "She wouldn't say, but she dropped a few hints." Hardwicke's name came up. Purbright handed him a cup. "It often does." As the sergeant slurped noisily, Purbright allowed himself a faint sigh. The web was growing, a tangle of debt, ambition, and pride. Somewhere in it, hidden as carefully as the missing charter, lay a truth no one wished to speak aloud, and tomorrow he would begin the delicate task of teasing out the first thread. Inspector Purbright preferred to begin an enquiry as a gardener might tend a particularly delicate bed of flowers. No sudden movements, no heavy-handed digging, just a patient clearing away of surface weeds to see what lay beneath. The morning after Sergeant Malley's enthusiastic report on Tom Larch's supposed guilt, Purbright set out to speak with the 3 names that had, by various routes, risen to the surface of local opinion. He carried with him no notebook, no visible badge of authority beyond his quiet presence, which in Flaxborough was enough to make even the most respectable citizens just a little uneasy. His first visit was to Councillor Hardwicke, who lived in a red brick house near the edge of town, a house that always seemed to be freshly painted and yet somehow perpetually damp around the base, like a politician smiling bravely through scandal. Hardwicke greeted him at the door with a show of surprise, so hearty it seemed rehearsed. "Inspector, well, this is a pleasure, though I imagine not purely social," Hardwicke said, ushering him inside. His living room was immaculate, as though prepared for an inspection of a different kind. Papers were stacked neatly on a polished table, their tidiness bordering on unnatural. Purbright allowed himself a courteous smile. "A small matter of routine, Councillor. I thought it might be helpful to clarify certain points regarding yesterday's luncheon." Hardwicke laughed, though the sound was thin.
"Ah, yes, the luncheon."
"What a fiasco, eh? Terribly embarrassing for the mayor. I told her not to make such a display of that old charter, but you know Beatrice. She thrives on ceremony." Purbright inclined his head, letting the councillor speak. He asked only the gentlest of questions. Who Hardwicke had spoken to during the luncheon, whether he had noticed anyone lingering near the display case, whether he himself had remained until the end. Each answer came too quickly, wrapped in an abundance of detail that somehow failed to satisfy. "I was with Mr. Digby and Councillor Cole the whole time," Hardwicke said, almost before Purbright had finished asking. Couldn't have been nearer the display case if I'd tried. In fact, I left directly after the mayor's speech, straight home. My wife will tell you so. Tea at exactly 3:30, as always, Purbright murmured his appreciation. A commendably punctual household. Though if I may, did anyone see you on your walk home? The streets were rather full, I imagine. Hardwick's hand fluttered toward his papers, then withdrew.
Oh, I couldn't say. People pass, and one doesn't always notice.
But truly, Inspector, I assure you I was nowhere near that office after the luncheon.
Goodness, why would I be?
Purbright gave a mild nod, as if the question required no answer. When he left, he paused just long enough to note that Hardwick closed the curtains behind him with a speed that suggested more than mere protection from the sun. From Hardwick's ordered house, Purbright made his way to the more chaotic premises of Mrs. Beatrice Tither. Her antiques shop was a warren of narrow aisles and precarious towers of miscellany, where objects seemed to lean conspiratorially toward one another. Mrs. Tither herself emerged from behind a tall wardrobe like a magician's assistant, all smiles and fluttering hands. Inspector, I was just telling a lady only this morning how relieved we all are that you're on the case.
Terrible business, terrible. Purbright acknowledged this with a slight bow of his head.
Indeed, Mrs. Tither. I understand you were near the mayor's office shortly before the charter was displayed. Strictly routine, you understand, but I wondered what brought you there. Her smile did not falter, but it did become slightly more fixed, as though pinned in place. Oh, well, you know how it is. I've been appraising a few items for the council's storage room.
Old lamps, mostly.
Quite worthless, but they like to have a record. I happened to pop by just before the luncheon to drop off my notes. Purbright glanced around the crowded shop. A generous service. Community spirit, Inspector.
One must do one's bit, she laughed too brightly.
Of course the place was bustling by then. Clerks and councillors running about.
I barely set foot inside. Purbright's tone was mild, almost conversational.
And did you happen to see anyone handling the display case? Perhaps checking the lock? Mrs. Tither's eyes flickered sideways just for an instant before she shook her head.
No, nothing like that.
I was in and out before I could notice. She waved a hand as if to dismiss the entire matter.
Honestly, the whole affair has been blown out of proportion.
Some absent-minded clerk will probably find the charter misfiled any day now. Purbright smiled as though the possibility comforted him greatly, then allowed the conversation to drift toward trivialities about business and weather before taking his leave. As he stepped back onto the street, he noted how swiftly the shop door closed behind him, the lock turning, with a decisiveness that suggested Mrs. Tither valued privacy above custom. The afternoon waned, and Purbright's final call was to Tom Larch. The handyman lived in a cramped cottage on a side street where laundry lines crisscrossed like nets for catching unwary visitors. Larch himself opened the door, looking both surprised and wary, a combination that settled awkwardly on his round, honest face. "Inspector," he said, wiping his hands on his trousers. "I wasn't expecting— well, come in if you like." The interior smelled faintly of paint and damp plaster. Tools lay scattered across a table, half-cleaned and abandoned, as if their owner had been interrupted mid-thought. Purbright seated himself carefully on a chair that wobbled slightly. "A simple matter, Mr. Larch," he began, his voice soothing. "I understand you've done some work at the mayor's office recently. Shelves, locks, minor repairs." Larch nodded quickly. "That's right. Nothing grand, mind you. Just fixing up things that have been loose for years." "And you were there the morning of the luncheon?"
I was, early on, before anyone else arrived.
"Tighten the screws on the display case, in fact?"
It was rattling something awful. Purbright allowed a small pause.
"And later that evening?"
"Where were you then?"
Larch shifted in his seat, eyes dropping to the floor.
"Home, mostly."
"Bit of work in the shed?"
"Mending tools. Anyone with you?"
The question hung lightly, as though of no great consequence. Larch swallowed. "No, just me," Purbright nodded as if perfectly satisfied. "And the bundle you carried home last night. Would that have been tools as well?" Larch's head jerked up, startled.
"Bundle? Oh, that? Yes, tools." Wrap them up so they wouldn't clatter.
Didn't want to wake the neighbours. The explanation came too quickly, its neatness slightly frayed at the edges. Purbright's expression gave nothing away. "Considerate of you," he said mildly. When he rose to leave, Larch followed him to the door, talking too fast about repairs he meant to finish, bills he had yet to send.
Neighbours who complained about nothing and everything back at the station.
Purbright sat alone at his desk as evening settled over the town. He reviewed the day in silence, sipping his tea. Hardwick's eagerness to be seen as uninvolved, Mrs. Teether's swift dismissal of her own presence near the office, Larch's nervous haste to explain an unseen bundle, each was a thread, fine and fragile. He did not yet know how they would weave together, but he felt certain that when they did, the pattern would be far less decorative than the townsfolk imagined. By mid-morning the following day, a sort of consensus had begun to harden around the figure of Tom Larch. It was as if the town itself, having toyed with speculation for 2 days, now wished to tidy matters away before the excitement curdled into unease. A culprit, after all, was as essential to civic harmony as a well-swept street. It allowed everyone to step neatly around guilt without soiling their own shoes. Sergeant Malley was particularly enthusiastic about this emerging solution. He entered Purbright's office with the air of a man bearing tidings so self-evidently correct that any questioning of them would be almost impolite. "Sir," he began, puffing slightly from the climb up the station stairs,
"I think we've got him. Larch, all the pieces fit."
"I've spoken to 3 neighbours and a cousin, and they all say the same. He's been desperate for money these past months. Gambling debts, some say. Drinking debts, others. Whichever it is, the man's in over his head. And who but a desperate man would nick the town charter?" Purbright set aside the pen with which he had been carefully correcting a misfiled report on bicycle licenses. "The charter," he repeated mildly, as though it were some curious object he had just been shown in a shop window. "Yes, sir." "Consider it. Larch worked on the display case himself. He knew its weaknesses, had the tools, and he was seen with that mysterious bundle last night. Perfect opportunity, perfect motive." Malley spread his hands with finality,
"As if unveiling a conjurer's last trick." "Perfect," Purbright echoed,
his tone so neutral that it might have been agreement or doubt. He studied the sergeant over his spectacles. "And yet, Sergeant, perfection in these matters often suggests rehearsal rather than reality." Malley blinked. "Sir," Purbright rose, stretching his back with deliberate slowness, "let us say for the sake of argument that Mr. Larch did indeed remove the charter. To what end?"
"Sell it, sir."
"These things fetch a tidy sum with collectors. Mrs. Teether says—" "Yes," Purbright interrupted gently. "Mrs. Teether says many things. She also said the charter would likely vanish into the shadowy world of private collectors before the week was out. Which is an interesting theory, but not, I think, the only one available to us." Malley shifted, clearly uncertain whether he had been complimented or contradicted. "Even so, sir, the man's debts are real enough, and he's hardly the sort to stand up for himself."
"If we bring him in, I doubt he'll put up much of a fight." "That," Purbright said,
reaching for his coat, "is precisely what concerns me." They arrived at the town council meeting room just as a heated discussion was reaching its peak. Councillor Hardwick was presiding, his florid face flushed with what might have been righteous anger or simple overexertion. A half-circle of other councillors surrounded him like an audience reluctantly attending a play they'd seen before. "The people demand resolution," Hardwick was declaring as Purbright entered. "We cannot let this scandal drag on, breeding suspicion and ridicule. The charter was taken by someone with access and knowledge. We have a duty to act decisively." Mayor Ordway sat stiffly at the far end of the table, her chain of office gleaming, but her expression brittle. She looked as though she might shatter under the strain of another speech. "Ah, Inspector," Hardwick said, spotting Purbright. "Just in time. Perhaps you'll confirm that your investigations point to the obvious culprit." Purbright inclined his head, non-committal. "I am aware that Mr. Larch has been mentioned. Mentioned? Hardwick's eyebrows shot up. The man practically confessed with his behaviour. Look at the facts. He alone repaired the display case. He alone was seen skulking about that evening. And he has every reason to sell the charter for quick cash. We cannot ignore such evidence. Indeed, Purbright said, with a calmness that only deepened the councillor's agitation. Evidence, however, has a curious habit of appearing more solid than it truly is, rather like jelly left too long in the refrigerator. A thin ripple of confusion passed through the room. Hardwick frowned. Are you suggesting we do nothing while this thief goes free? I am suggesting, Purbright replied, his tone as mild as milk, that haste may produce errors which are harder to correct than they are to prevent. Before Hardwick could retort, Mayor Ordway spoke, her voice sharp with desperation. Inspector, the council's reputation is at stake. We need to show the public that we are in control. If you have doubts, please share them now. Purbright allowed a thoughtful pause, during which the room seemed to lean toward him. Mr. Larch, he said at last, had access, certainly. He also has debts, as do many others in this town, and he was seen carrying a bundle, which he explained as tools. That explanation may be unsatisfactory, but it is at least plausible. What troubles me is that the case against him appears to fit together too neatly, like a puzzle arranged by someone who already knew the picture on the box. A councillor at the back cleared his throat nervously. Hardwick's colour deepened. You mean someone is framing him? I mean, Purbright said, almost pleasantly, that it would be premature to close our eyes to other possibilities. Consider, for instance, who gains from the charter's disappearance. The document itself is of modest monetary value, but it has great influence over current debates concerning the riverside development. Without certain clauses in that charter, certain restrictions vanish, and certain fortunes may be made. There was a brief, uncomfortable silence. Several councillors shifted in their chairs as though the room had suddenly become too warm. Hardwick gave a brittle laugh. Now, Inspector, let's not descend into conspiracy theories. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one. In this case, that explanation is a single dishonest man driven by greed. Purbright's expression did not change, but his eyes moved slowly across the assembled faces. Simplicity, councillor, is a virtue in cooking and furniture design. In human behaviour, it is more often a disguise. The remark hung in the air like a faint but persistent smell. When the meeting adjourned, the councillors departed quickly, eager to be seen neither too close to Hardwick nor too far from him. Mayor Ordway lingered, wringing her hands.
Inspector, you do believe Tom Larch is innocent, don't you?
Purbright offered a small, courteous shrug. Belief, Madam Mayor, is a luxury I am rarely afforded. I merely observe, and sometimes, if I am lucky, I understand. He left her with that and returned to the station, where Mally awaited him like a terrier ready for another chase. Well, sir, are we bringing him in or not? Not yet, Sergeant. Purbright removed his coat with unhurried precision. For now, let us watch and listen. If Mr. Larch is guilty, he will reveal it soon enough. If he is not, he allowed the sentence to drift away like smoke. Mally frowned.
And in the meantime?
In the meantime, Purbright said, settling behind his desk, we shall consider who benefits most from a resolution that is too tidy to be true. Outside, the afternoon light faded and the town, believing itself safer for having chosen its scapegoat, prepared for evening. Purbright, however, sat very still, listening to the silence between the facts. It was in those silences he knew that the real story often hid. The day after the council meeting dawned cold and pale, as if the sky itself disapproved of recent events. Flaxborough, however, seemed intent on warming itself with certainty. By breakfast, the town was already digesting the notion of Tom Larch's guilt as thoroughly as it did its toast and marmalade. The baker's wife announced that she had always suspected something shifty about him, while the postman declared that he had once seen Larch look guilty-like over a broken window pane 20 years before. It was becoming less a question of whether Larch had stolen the charter and more a matter of why the authorities had been so slow to admit it. At the police station, Sergeant Malley was positively buoyant. "So there's talk of bringing Larch in before the week's out. Councillor Hardwick's pressing for it. Says we'll lose public trust if we dither." Purbright merely nodded and reached for his coat. "Public trust," he said mildly, "is a peculiar substance, Sergeant. Like blancmange, easy to stir, but difficult to keep firm." He left before Malley could decide whether this was profound or merely irrelevant, making his way toward the mayor's office. Though his pace was unhurried, there was purpose beneath the calm exterior. He had no intention of arresting anyone just yet, but he disliked mysteries that appeared too conveniently solved. The mayor's office was quieter than usual, most of the staff having been dispatched to various committees and errands designed to look like progress. A lone junior clerk sat behind a high desk, his nose buried in paperwork. He started visibly when Purbright greeted him. "Morning," Purbright said pleasantly. "No need to get up. I've only come to glance at the records concerning the charter's display."
Simple housekeeping matter.
The young man, pale and anxious, nodded and gestured toward a ledger at the far end of the counter.
"Everything's there, sir."
Dates, sign-ins, who had keys, all that. Purbright thanked him and began leafing through the heavy book. It was the sort of municipal record that carried its own faint scent of bureaucracy, ink, dust, and resignation. The pages were neatly ruled and written in a tidy, clerkly hand, each entry signed and timed with a precision bordering on the compulsive. It was on the third page that Purbright noticed it, a smudge, barely visible at first glance. It sat beside the initials of the last person recorded as having checked the display case before the luncheon. The mark was a faint bluish-black, slightly oily, and altogether unlike the crisp, dark lines of the office's usual fountain pens. He bent closer. To anyone else it would have looked like a mere blot, the kind of accident easily explained by haste or clumsiness. But to Purbright, who had spent years noticing the small things others overlooked, it suggested something else entirely. He closed the ledger gently and turned back to the clerk. "Curious shade of ink, this one," he remarked in an idle tone.
"Not quite the same as the rest."
"Do you keep more than one sort of pen here?" The young man blinked. "Oh, no, sir. Just the council's standard issue. We've used the same for years." "Ah," Purbright smiled. "And who made this particular entry?" The clerk craned his neck, then frowned. "Councillor Hardwick, sir." He insisted on checking the case himself just before the luncheon began. "Said it was important to show diligence." Purbright nodded slowly. "Very commendable of him." He closed the ledger with deliberate care. "You've been most helpful." As he stepped outside into the chill afternoon air, his expression remained as placid as ever, though his thoughts were quietly rearranging themselves. A smudge of the wrong ink was hardly proof of anything, yet it spoke of interference. Someone had either altered the records or been careless in covering their tracks. The timing was too neat, Hardwick signing the ledger moments before the charter vanished. Back at the station, Malley was waiting, his manner brisk. "So there's been more pressure from the council. They want to issue a statement naming Larch as the main suspect. It'll calm folks down." Purbright removed his coat and set it on the stand. "Calm them down or feed their appetite for certainty, Sergeant. The two are rarely identical," Malley frowned. "With respect, sir, you sound like you don't think he did it." Purbright gave him a polite smile. "I think, Sergeant, that the truth is often like a hedgehog crossing the road, difficult to see until one notices the small disturbance in the gravel." Malley's confusion deepened. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Purbright said gently, "that there is a disturbance, but not necessarily where everyone is looking." He produced the ledger and placed it on the desk.
"Observe this entry." Malley peered at the page, squinting.
"Looks like Hardwick signed it, and—" Purbright tapped the smudge lightly. "Our office pens produce a sharp, clean black. This mark, however, is of a different make. Likely a private pen, perhaps carried by someone who wished to appear official while recording something.
Unofficial, the sergeant's brow furrowed.
Couldn't it just be a slip? It could, Purbright agreed mildly. But slips do not alter the flow of events. Consider, if this entry were forged, it would suggest someone wished to fix the time at which the case was last checked. And if the time were fixed falsely, he let the implication trail away like a trail of smoke. Mally's mouth opened, then closed again. So someone might be setting up larch, or protecting themselves, Purbright said. Either way, the smudge tells us there is a hand in this affair which does not wish to be seen. That evening, Purbright returned alone to the mayor's office. The corridors were empty, the echo of his footsteps absorbed by the heavy carpet. He stood before the display case, now locked and empty, and regarded it with the quiet attention of a man studying an unplayed piano. There were no scratches, no obvious signs of tampering. Whoever had removed the charter had done so with a calmness almost artistic. He imagined Hardwick bustling in to sign the ledger. Imagine Mrs. Tither conveniently present earlier that morning. Imagine Tom Larch repairing the case days before. Each figure moved in his mind like a piece on a chessboard, their actions intersecting just enough to confuse the onlooker. On his way out, he passed the records room again. The young clerk was gone, the lights dimmed. Purbright paused, his gaze lingering on the shelves. So many books, so many tidy pages of times and names, all of them official, all of them unquestioned. And yet a single smudge had told him more than 100 signatures ever could. As he stepped into the cold night air, he reflected that the case against Larch was built on appearances carefully arranged. Appearances like ink could be smudged. The truth, however, had a way of leaving its own faint mark, visible only to those patient enough to notice. Purbright adjusted his scarf and walked back toward the station.
Unseen and unhurried, carrying with him the quiet certainty that somewhere in Flaxborough,
someone's carefully written story was about to come undone. The morning crept in under a low, colourless sky, the kind of day that made even the cheeriest shop window look tired. Purbright moved through Flaxborough with his customary calm, but inside his thoughts were quietly stirring. The smudge of alien ink on the council ledger had not given him answers, only questions. And questions, he knew, were far more dangerous things to handle than evidence. The council's campaign to present Tom Larch as the culprit continued unabated. Posters had begun to appear in the windows of a few loyal citizens proclaiming support our council, justice for the charter. They did not name Larch directly, but their implication was unmistakable. It was as though the town itself were laying down a verdict before the trial had even begun. Purbright, however, felt no haste to follow the crowd's reasoning. Instead, he allowed his inquiry to ripple outward. Where before he had spoken only to the key figures, now he began to circle wider, listening for the faint notes that did not fit the tune everyone else seemed eager to hum. Mrs. Tither's antiques shop was his first port of call. A faint bell tinkled as he entered, and a scent of beeswax, mildew, and something less definable, a whiff of secrecy, perhaps, met him like an old acquaintance. Mrs. Tither emerged from behind a display of mismatched teapots. Her smile stretched almost to transparency. "Inspector? What a pleasant surprise. Looking for a little something to brighten the station? Perhaps a nice vase for the evidence room?" Purbright's expression was one of polite amusement. "Alas, I fear my purpose is less decorative. I wondered, Mrs. Tither, whether you might show me any civic memorabilia you've handled recently."
Items connected to the mayor's office, perhaps. She tilted her head, considering.
"Oh, a few odds and ends. Old paperweights, plaques, the usual clutter no one really wants, but no one dares throw away."
"Why do you ask?" "Idle curiosity," Purbright replied smoothly.
"Sometimes the fate of large things may be hinted at by smaller ones." With a rustle of skirts, Mrs. Tither led him to a back room where shelves sagged under the weight of accumulated history. She picked up a small brass plate. its surface tarnished but engraved with the words Flaxborough Civic Display, 1873 restoration. This was attached to the old display case, you know, she said. It came loose years ago. The council sent it over for safekeeping until they decided whether to reattach it. Never did, of course. Purbright accepted the plate with careful fingers. The engraving was neat, the lettering even. Yet something about it troubled him. His thumb traced a faint irregularity along the edge, a burr that suggested it had been recently handled, perhaps even polished in places, though the rest remained dull. This came from the very case in which the charter was kept? He asked, his tone casual. Mrs. Tither hesitated fractionally. Oh yes, quite sure of it.
Why, is there a problem?
None at all. He smiled faintly and set the plate back on the shelf. Merely a reminder that the past clings to the present in curious ways. Her laughter was a shade too loud. Well, if you find a market for old brass plaques, Inspector, do let me know. As he left the shop, Purbright considered what he had seen. A plate removed long ago yet recently polished. An object that had no reason to be touched unless someone had needed to copy or alter it. The thought was small but persistent, like the smudge of ink on the ledger. On his way back through the marketplace, he paused outside a bakery where two women were gossiping with the intensity of strategists plotting a campaign. Their words drifted toward him, unheeded by the speakers.
Saw him myself, I tell you, one insisted.
Late at night, near the old bridge, Councillor Hardwick meeting some stranger. Tall fellow, coat turned up.
Whispering like they didn't want to be seen. Well, that doesn't surprise me, the other replied.
Hardwick's always got schemes going.
Probably arranging some deal about that Riverside project.
Purbright moved on without changing pace, but his mind filed the remark carefully. Hardwick's name again, tied now to a secret meeting. It was another thread, thin but worth following. That afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to the local historical society. It was housed in a converted chapel, its walls lined with cabinets displaying relics of Flaxborough's past, faded photographs, fragments of pottery, and documents whose significance was known to only a few. Here he encountered Dr. Lionel Frobisher. The man was immediately distinctive, tall and angular, with a mane of silver hair that seemed always to be in motion, and eyes that glittered with an enthusiasm bordering on the theatrical. He greeted Purbright with effusive charm. Inspector, a rare honour. I've heard of your work, of course. Dull business, I imagine, chasing after miscreants and misfiled forms. But today, surely, you come on a matter of true historical importance. Purbright inclined his head. The missing charter has, I believe, caused some stir here as well. A stir? Frobisher exclaimed, clasping his hands dramatically. My dear sir, it is nothing less than a catastrophe. That document is the foundation of Flaxborough's identity. Without it, our past is a house built on sand. Yet the town continues to stand, Purbright observed mildly. Stand? Yes, Frobisher said, pacing the narrow aisle between display cases, but precariously. People do not appreciate the Charter's subtleties, the clauses, the codicils, the delicate balances struck centuries ago. It is the very soul of civic order. Purbright watched him without appearing to do so. You speak as one intimately familiar with its contents. I should hope so. I've studied every line, every annotation. Why, I could recite whole passages from memory. Not that anyone cares, of course. Councillors see it as a prop, a bit of stage dressing for their ceremonies. But I know its true worth. There was a fervour in his voice that intrigued Purbright. I understand Councillor Hardwick inspected the case shortly before the theft, he said, as if idly. Did he ever consult you regarding its significance? Frobisher's mouth tightened, then curved into a smile too quick to be natural.
Oh, Hardwick, no.
He wouldn't lower himself to seek guidance from a mere historian. He prefers to improvise. Purbright let the remark hang before shifting the subject. You've heard, perhaps, that suspicion has fallen on Tom Larch. A travesty, Frobisher cried. The man is a simpleton with a hammer, What possible interest could he have in a document whose value is intellectual rather than monetary?
Mark my words, Inspector, this is no common theft. It is an act of erasure. Erasure?
Purbright echoed, his tone neutral. Frobisher leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Someone wishes to alter the record of history, to remove a barrier perhaps to certain modern ambitions. A charter is not merely parchment, Inspector. It is power. Purbright regarded him steadily. An interesting perspective. You must tell me more in time. As he left the Historical Society, Purbright's mind sifted through the day's findings. A polished plaque in Mrs. Tyther's shop, a whispered meeting by the old bridge, a historian whose passion for the charter seemed almost too fierce. The threads were beginning to show themselves, tangling and crossing. Somewhere within them lay the pattern he sought. It would not, he suspected, be one of simplicity, and it would not most certainly be kind. The fire was first noticed not by Mrs. Tither herself, but by a passing milkman, who spotted a faint thread of smoke curling out from beneath the eaves of her shop. At first, he thought it no more than a chimney backdraft, but when he returned a few minutes later, the smoke had grown into a sooty plume that licked the pale morning air.
He shouted, dropped his crate of bottles with a crash,
and began pounding on the shop's door. By the time Mrs. Tither appeared, breathless and agitated, a handful of neighbours had gathered in a circle of fascination and alarm. She was clad in a quilted dressing gown of formidable floral design, her hair wrapped hastily in a scarf. Her hands fluttered in a sort of helpless semaphore. Fire?
"Here, oh heavens above!"
"The back room," she wailed. Purbright, summoned by a constable who had been making his rounds, arrived to find two firemen methodically damping down what remained of the blaze. The damage, though far from catastrophic, was significant. Charred beams, a mound of ash where wooden shelves had once stood, and the pervasive,
acrid scent of burnt paper. Mrs. Tither clung to Purbright's sleeve like a drowning woman to a lifebelt. "Inspector, this is terrible."
"My records gone. Decades of sales, receipts, provenance notes,
all destroyed.
I shall never recover." Purbright disengaged himself with gentle firmness and surveyed the blackened room. His gaze lingered on a corner where the flames seemed to have burned most fiercely. "A back room," he said softly, "with so much to lose and yet so little saved." Mrs. Tither's eyes widened. "Are you implying someone set this fire deliberately?"
"Oh, the wickedness!"
"To target a poor woman's livelihood?" "I imply nothing," Purbright replied mildly. "But fires, like thieves, have habits. They begin where they are encouraged." The constable at his side shifted uneasily. "So there's no sign of forced entry. Could have been an accident, faulty wiring maybe." "Possibly," Purbright agreed. He crouched, studying the remains of what had once been several thick ledgers. Only the faintest edges remained, curling and blackened, though one must wonder why fate chooses so precise a spot to exercise its mischief. Outside, the crowd buzzed with speculation. Word of the fire had spread as swiftly as the smoke, and already theories were blooming like weeds. Some declared it proof of a conspiracy. The very records that might have revealed the charter's true history had been deliberately destroyed. Others suggested Mrs. Tither herself had set the blaze for the insurance money, though in the next breath they swore she was too timid for such wickedness. When Councillor Hardwick appeared, striding through the onlookers like a general inspecting his troops, the mood shifted toward outrage.
"This," he proclaimed loudly, gesturing at the scorched doorway, "is an attack not merely on a shop but on the integrity of our town.
First the charter disappears, now vital records are lost.
Make no mistake that this is political."
The word carried like a spark through dry tinder. Political. It gave shape to every unease, every whispered suspicion about the riverside development scheme. People began to murmur that perhaps the theft and the fire were two strokes of the same hand, aimed at clearing obstacles to some hidden plan. Mayor Ordway, arriving moments later, looked pale and harried. She took Purbright aside, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "Inspector, we must show decisiveness. The council is under siege from rumour. Hardwick insists we name a culprit before panic spreads." Purbright's expression was unreadable. "Naming a culprit is simple, Madam Mayor. Naming the right one is rather harder." "But surely," she whispered, glancing nervously at the crowd, "this strengthens the case against Tom Larch. Who else would benefit from chaos?" Purbright's gaze drifted toward Mrs. Tither, who was theatrically wringing her hands for the benefit of several sympathetic bystanders. Chaos, Madam Mayor, is rarely without a conductor. Later that day, back at the station, Purbright sat with Sergeant Malley reviewing what little evidence remained.
Malley was brimming with indignation. "Sir, it's too much of a coincidence."
First, the charter disappears. Now the very records that could tell us who handled it go up in flames. Larch must have done it to cover his tracks. "Indeed," Purbright murmured, examining a charred scrap retrieved from the fire. It bore the faint imprint of columns and numbers, the skeletal remains of Mrs. Tither's bookkeeping.
"And yet, Sergeant, one might equally argue that someone else wished to cover theirs," Malley frowned.
"You think Mrs. Tither's lying?" "I think," Purbright said, setting down the fragment, "that truth and lies rarely travel separately. They prefer to mingle, each lending the other plausibility." He leaned back in his chair. "Consider this. The fire began in a corner far from the wiring or stove. It consumed paper but left surrounding objects oddly untouched. That suggests a focused flame applied with care." Malley rubbed his chin.
"Arson, then, perhaps."
"But arson requires motive, and motive requires imagination. Tom Larch is practical, yes, but imaginative?"
"I wonder." As they spoke, a knock sounded at the door.
It was a constable, bearing fresh news. "Sir, there's talk around the old bridge. Someone claims they saw Councillor Hardwick there again last night, meeting the same mysterious fellow as before." Purbright's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did they describe this companion?" "Tall, sir. Wore a dark coat, hat pulled low."
"That's all." When the constable left, Malley leaned forward eagerly. "Could be our arsonist."
"Hardwick might be in on it himself." Purbright's tone was dry. "The difficulty with shadows, Sergeant, is that they so rarely volunteer their names." That evening, Purbright returned alone to the smouldering ruins of Mrs. Tither's back room. The fireman had long since departed, leaving behind a silence punctuated only by the creak of settling beams. He walked slowly, his lantern casting soft pools of light over the blackened floorboards. Near the centre of the destruction, he paused. Something glimmered faintly amid the ash, a small brass screw, warped by heat. Kneeling, he examined it closely. It matched the fittings on the plaque he had handled the previous day, the one supposedly detached from the charter's display case years ago. So the plaque had been here recently, though Mrs. Tither had claimed it had remained untouched in her shop for years.
Why move it?
Why, unless it bore some connection to the theft, and someone wished to erase that link. As he pocketed the screw, a soft sound reached him, a voice outside, raised in mock cheerful greeting. Stepping into the shadows, Purbright watched through a crack in the ruined doorway as Dr. Lionel Frobisher approached, his silver hair catching the lantern light. Tragic, isn't it? Frobisher called to no one in particular, spreading his arms theatrically, history itself reduced to ashes, a crime against memory. He peered into the darkness, his expression a careful mask of concern.
"Inspector, are you here? I had to see it for myself." Purbright stepped forward, his face impassive.
"You keep late hours, Doctor." "History never sleeps," Frobisher replied smoothly. "I came to pay my respects. Poor Mrs. Tither, she has always been a custodian of our town's past. To see her treasures destroyed—" He shook his head, apparently overcome. Purbright studied him in silence. There was something a little too practiced in the man's sorrow, like a speech delivered to an audience only he could see. "Indeed," Purbright said at last. "The past is fragile. Sometimes it burns even more easily than paper." As Frobisher departed, the inspector turned back to the ruins. The fire, he realized, had shifted the investigation. This was no longer merely about a missing charter or a man's debts. It was about the deliberate rewriting of Flaxborough's history, a cleansing by flame. Outside, the night was very still, but Purbright could almost hear the murmurs rising through the town. Political intrigue, secret bargains, enemies made and unmade in whispers. The smoke had cleared, but the air remained thick with suspicion, and somewhere in that haze the truth waited. Smudged, altered, but not yet erased. The station was unusually still that evening. Sergeant Malley had finally been persuaded to go home for a meal, the constables had finished their rounds, and the clatter of typewriters from the clerk's room had given way to silence. Only the ticking of the station clock disturbed the quiet, each measured beat like a reminder that time, unlike people, never attempted to disguise itself. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, a single lamp casting a warm but solitary circle of light. The papers before him lay untouched. His hands were folded loosely, his gaze fixed not on the room, but on a space somewhere beyond it, as though his mind were walking slowly down one of Flaxborough's shadowed alleys. The day's events returned to him in fragments, the smell of scorched paper in Mrs. Tither's back room, Frobisher's theatrical gestures, Hardwick's strained joviality, the smudge of ink in the ledger. Each fragment seemed small, unconnected, and yet he knew that, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across a table, they belonged to the same whole. Purbright's experience had taught him that crimes were rarely committed solely for gain. Money was a convenient motive, certainly, and one that the world was comfortable believing in. But beneath it often lay something far more potent: vanity, pride, the fear of being thought foolish. In a town like Flaxborough, where reputations were as brittle and polished as Mrs. Tither's antiques, the terror of disgrace was a sharper spur than any financial temptation. He thought of Tom Larch, stumbling over his words, his face mottled with anxiety. A man like Larch might indeed steal to pay off debts, but Larch's lies, and Purbright was certain they were lies of some sort, had the flavour not of cunning, but of shame. It was not the manner of a criminal concealing a bold act, but of a timid soul trying desperately to avoid humiliation. Then there was Mrs. Tither, whose every gesture was a performance staged for an audience of neighbours. Her reaction to the fire had been perfect, dramatic enough to elicit sympathy, but not so wild as to seem false. Yet beneath her theatrics, Purbright sensed a deeper note, not grief for lost records, but alarm at what those records might have revealed. And Hardwick.
Hardwick.
The counsellor had been almost too ready with his outrage, too eager to assign blame and move forward. He was a man accustomed to arranging appearances like furniture. As long as they looked solid, it did not matter if the legs were hollow. His meeting by the old bridge, whispered about by gossips, suggested dealings he would never confess to openly. But Purbright was not yet convinced Hardwick's ambitions extended to theft or arson. Perhaps his secret was merely one of political manoeuvring, unconnected but awkwardly timed. Purbright's gaze drifted to the brass screw he had found in the ashes of Mrs. Tither's shop. It lay on his blotter now, a small, warped relic. It seemed absurd that such a thing might tip the balance of an investigation. Yet he had learned long ago that the smallest details were often the most revealing.
A single loose thread could unravel an entire tapestry, provided one had the patience to pull gently rather than tug in haste. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly.
A memory surfaced, a case years ago in a neighbouring town. His ceremonial silver cup had gone missing just before a civic parade. All evidence had pointed to a young clerk who had been careless with the keys. The town was ready to condemn him when Purbright noticed a trivial inconsistency, a fingerprint in polish that should have been wiped away. The truth, when it emerged, had been less dramatic than the rumours. The cup had not been stolen for profit, but hidden by an alderman terrified of losing face over a minor dent he himself had caused. He had preferred to create a mystery rather than endure the laughter of his peers. People lied, Purbright reflected, not always to conceal crimes, but to avoid embarrassment. They feared laughter more than punishment, disgrace more than justice. In Flaxborough, where social standing was measured in minute and exacting increments, that fear could twist even the simplest events into knots of deceit. He opened his eyes and regarded the smudge of ink he had carefully copied onto a scrap of paper. The irregular colour, the slight oiliness, a private pen, carried by someone wishing to appear official. Why had Hardwick, who prided himself on public displays of duty, used such a pen rather than the standard council issue? Or had he? Perhaps someone else had made that entry, knowing it would bear Hardwick's name. Frobisher's words returned to him. An act of erasure. The historian had been almost poetic in his vehemence. Too poetic, perhaps. His grief over the missing charter was genuine, but grief could be genuine and still serve as camouflage. Passion was a useful screen behind which to hide calculation. Purbright rose and walked slowly to the window. Outside, the lamplight blurred in the mist, softening the outlines of the town. Somewhere out there, the truth moved quietly among the shadows, waiting for him to notice it. He considered the three central figures again. Larch, timid and over-eager to please. Mrs. Tither, dramatic yet evasive. Hardwick, blustering and political. They were all lying, of that he was certain. But only one lie truly mattered, and that lie would not sound like a falsehood. It would sound like a truth spoken too quickly, too confidently. The memory of the silver cup case sharpened in his mind. The alderman had spoken with absolute authority about the cup's disappearance, because he had been the one to make it disappear. So too, perhaps in this case, the person who professed the greatest concern for the charter's safety might be the very one who had spirited it away. Purbright returned to his desk and sat down again, his face calm, his thoughts quietly ordered. The fire, the smudge of ink, the polished plaque, the convenient narrative of Tom Larch's guilt, they were all pieces of a story someone else had written. Tomorrow, he decided he would stop reading and begin editing. And when he was finished, the true author would be forced to step into the light, however reluctant they might be. The station clock ticked on. Purbright sat alone, a patient man in a town full of hurried lies, waiting for the moment when silence would speak louder than any confession. The notice went out in the quiet, unobtrusive way that Purbright preferred. It was simply announced that in light of recent events, the inspector would be holding a short, informal gathering at the mayor's office to discuss community concerns. The phrasing was deliberately vague, leaving each invitee to decide what the true purpose might be. By the appointed evening, the council chamber was modestly filled. Mayor Ordway presided nervously at one end of the long table, her chain of office gleaming like armour she did not quite know how to wear. Councillor Hardwick, bustling and red-faced, took the chair to her right. Mrs. Tither arrived late, trailing the scent of lavender and smoke, her eyes darting about as if searching for allies. Dr. Frobisher appeared precisely on time, his silver hair perfectly arranged and his expression one of solicitous concern, as though he were attending a funeral whose outcome he alone could improve. Tom Larch had been invited as well, but he sat at the far end, half hidden behind a pillar, his hands twisting in his lap. He looked like a man who had stumbled into a play without knowing any of the lines. Purbright opened the meeting with a few mild remarks about unity and the importance of safeguarding Flaxborough's heritage. His voice was so even, so reasonable, that several of those present visibly relaxed, which was precisely his intention. "We have all," he said, Suffered from confusion these past weeks. The missing charter, the regrettable fire.
I thought it might be useful simply to talk together to clear away misunderstandings.
No accusations, merely conversation. Hardwick thumped the table.
Hear, hear.
The sooner we sort this business, the better. The town's patience is wearing thin. Indeed, Purbright murmured. Perhaps we might begin by hearing from Mrs. Tither. You, madam, have been most unfortunate. Mrs. Tither clasped her hands dramatically.
Unfortunate? Inspector, I am ruined.
My precious records, the very backbone of my business, reduced to ash.
I scarcely know how I shall go on. Purbright tilted his head as if puzzled.
And yet, Mrs. Tither, a curious thing. When I examined the ruins, I noted that the fire seemed selective. Entire shelves gone, but certain items nearby left untouched. A most considerate flame, her painted lips trembled. Well, fire behaves strangely, does it not? The drafts, the nature of the wood, of course. Purbright's tone was gentle.
And these records, they covered all your dealings with the council, did they not?
Items held on their behalf, receipts for historical pieces, dates and signatures?
Yes, she said too quickly, then caught herself.
That is to say, some records were personal naturally, household inventories, private collections. She faltered under Purbright's calm gaze, her voice trailing into silence. The inspector nodded as though perfectly satisfied and turned smoothly to Hardwick. Councillor, perhaps you might tell us about the measures being taken to protect remaining documents, particularly those connected with the Riverside Development Scheme. Hardwick straightened, puffing out his chest. Gladly, Inspector. Transparency is vital after all.
All council funds are accounted for, every penny.
Why, only last month we commissioned an independent audit. Quite unnecessary if you ask me, but there it is. And your own interests, Councillor?
I hear you have property near the proposed site. Merely coincidence.
Hardwick's laugh was too loud, too ready. A man must live somewhere. Yes, I own a few plots, but they are of no significance. Frankly, I shall probably lose money on the whole affair. You know how these things go, red tape, legal fees. Why, my own accounts are stretched to the limit. I've had to take out a personal loan just to— He broke off, suddenly aware he had been speaking rather too freely. Purbright inclined his head. It is good of you to share so openly.
Openness, after all, dispels suspicion, Hardwick muttered agreement. Dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Now, Purbright said,
turning his mild gaze upon Dr. Frobisher. Perhaps you might enlighten us on the charter itself. Many here, I suspect, do not fully appreciate its contents. Frobisher clasped his hands as if about to deliver a sermon. Gladly, Inspector. The charter is a unique document, centuries old. It defines the very structure of our town's governance. Its clauses, some quite obscure, regulate land use, trade rights, and ceremonial duties. Without it, our legal foundation is precarious. Could you, for instance, Purbright asked casually, describe the clause concerning riverside land?
Ah, Frobisher's eyes gleamed.
Clause 42.
A fascinating relic of medieval thinking.
It stipulates that the land be held in trust for public use, barring private development unless certain ancestral rights are proven. Quite archaic, really.
No modern court would give it weight. Purbright regarded him steadily.
And yet you recite it with remarkable precision. Frobisher smiled, though there was a tightness to it. One must be thorough, Inspector.
Knowledge is my vocation, Purbright said softly. I imagine such knowledge could be very useful to someone wishing to alter the town's future. A ripple passed through the room.
Frobisher spread his hands.
I merely study, sir. Others act. Purbright let the silence stretch before speaking again, his tone deceptively mild.
Curious, is it not, how each of us has suffered some misfortune of late? Mrs. Tither has lost her records. Councillor Hardwick, his peace of mind. Dr. Frobisher, his beloved charter. Even poor Mr. Larch, his good name. Tom Larch twitched at the mention of his name, staring at his boots. The inspector's eyes moved slowly from face to face. When misfortunes cluster so neatly, one must wonder if they are natural.
or arranged. Mrs. Tither dabbed at her eyes, muttering about wickedness.
Hardwick made a show of indignation, while Frobisher sat very still, his smile fixed like paint on porcelain. Purbright rose, smoothing his jacket. This meeting has been most enlightening.
I thank you all for your candour. As the gathering dispersed, he noted their departures carefully. Mrs. Tither bustled out first, her shawl askew, casting quick glances over her shoulder.
Hardwick followed, muttering to himself, still flushed from his own speech. Frobisher lingered a moment too long, as if reluctant to leave. When he finally moved toward the door, he paused beside Purbright and said, almost lightly, "Inspector, you do enjoy your little games." Purbright's expression was one of mild puzzlement. "Games, Doctor?"
I assure you I am far too dull for such things. Frobisher's smile thinned.
Dullness can be deceptive. When the room was empty, Purbright stood alone, replaying the evening's exchanges in his mind. Mrs. Tither's fluttering evasions, Hardwick's overdone protestations, Frobisher's precise recital. Each had revealed something, but only one reaction had struck the perfect, subtle chord, not too flustered, not too defensive, but edged with the unease of a man who knew the truth was inching closer. It was not the guilty man's shout or the liar's stammer that interested Purbright most. It was the silence Frobisher had left behind when his footsteps faded, a silence that felt almost deliberate, like a page turned just before the crucial line. The council chamber was filled with the peculiar kind of silence that precedes either revelation or disaster. Heavy curtains muffled the early evening sounds of the marketplace beyond, leaving only the soft scrape of chairs and the nervous clearing of throats. The familiar faces of Flaxborough's civic life were gathered around the long oak table, each wearing an expression carefully chosen for the occasion. Mrs. Tither, wide-eyed and tremulous, her hands folded like a penitent's. Hardwick, flushed and indignant, his jaw set in belligerent readiness. Dr. Frobisher, composed but just a shade too still, his silver hair gleaming under the lamps. At the head of the table sat Purbright, perfectly calm, his papers neatly stacked before him. Sergeant Malley stood to one side, alert but silent. Even Mayor Ordway seemed subdued, her usual flustered dignity replaced by a rigid watchfulness. Purbright began without ceremony, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our purpose this evening is a simple one, to set down the truth clearly and without rancour. These past days have seen confusion, accusation, and, sadly, destruction. A town cannot thrive on rumour. It requires facts." Hardwick thumped the table.
"Hear, hear."
"Let's have the facts and see this matter settled." Purbright inclined his head, the smallest acknowledgement of Hardwick's outburst. "Indeed, let us begin with what we know. A valuable document, the town's charter, vanished during a public event. Shortly thereafter, a fire consumed records that might have clarified its fate. It was natural to assume theft, perhaps by someone seeking money."
Natural, but wrong. A faint ripple of unease moved through the room. Mrs. Tither's lips parted, then closed again. Purbright continued, unhurried.
The charter was not taken for profit. It was removed because of what it contained. Specifically, Clause 42, a passage obscure enough to escape casual notice, yet clear enough in its legal effect. That clause prohibits private development of the riverside land unless very old and particular family rights can be proven. In plain language, without that clause, the land may be freely bought and sold. All eyes turned to Hardwick, who sputtered indignantly.
"Are you accusing me, Inspector?"
"My involvement in the development scheme is entirely proper. My holdings were declared publicly." "Precisely so," Purbright said smoothly. "You declared them. You have been, if anything, painfully public, which is why, despite your bluster, I do not believe you removed the charter. You needed it intact to prove that your actions were lawful." Hardwick blinked, thrown off balance. "Then who—" "Patience, counsellor. Purbright's tone was polite, but it brooked no interruption. Consider instead Mrs. Tither. She too has been less than forthcoming. The fire in her shop destroyed ledgers that might have shown who handled the display case and when. But Mrs. Tither did not set the blaze to conceal theft. She feared discovery of certain embellishments in her business dealings, small forgeries, inflated valuations, embarrassments, not crimes of grand design. She lied out of habit and self-preservation, not malice, Mrs. Tither gasped, then covered her mouth with her hands.
Inspector, I never meant... Purbright raised a hand gently. I know, madam.
Your part in this was incidental. You were manipulated, as was Councillor Hardwick.
Neither of you sought the destruction of the charter. He let that sink in before turning his gaze toward Dr. Frobisher. The historian met his eyes without flinching.
But a muscle in his jaw twitched. The key, Purbright said softly, lies not in politics or profit, but in history. Clause 42 mentions certain ancestral rights, ancient family claims to the riverside land. In all Flaxborough there is but one family whose lineage matches those terms exactly. The Frobishers. A collective intake of breath swept the chamber. Dr. Frobisher's composure held, but his knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. You, Purbright went on, were the only person with both the knowledge to recognize the clause and the motive to erase it. Without the clause, the land becomes common property, free of encumbrance. With it, the land remains forever bound to your family name, but also bound to certain duties and restrictions you would prefer remain forgotten. Dr. Frobisher's voice, when it came, was smooth but cold.
An interesting theory, Inspector.
But theory it remains.
Where is your proof?
Purbright's mild smile deepened just a fraction. Proof is seldom a single thing, Doctor. It is a pattern of small truths. For instance, the smudge of unfamiliar ink on the council ledger made by a private pen. You alone among those present carry such a pen, which you used to forge Councillor Hardwick's signature, creating a false record of when the display case was last inspected. Hardwick gaped, his outrage temporarily silenced. Then there is the brass plaque from the display case, Purbright continued. You removed it from storage, copied its design to construct a replica, and returned it before anyone noticed. The replica allowed you to tamper with the case unnoticed during preparations for the luncheon. When Mrs. Tither's ledgers threatened to reveal this, you arranged for a small, carefully placed fire to consume them, and nothing more. Mrs. Tither moaned softly into her shawl. Finally, Purbright said, his tone still courteous, there is the matter of your behaviour. When we first spoke, you recited Clause 42 from memory, dismissing it as archaic. Yet no one had mentioned it by name. You revealed knowledge only the Charter itself could provide. Dr. Frobisher's lips curved into a tight, bitter smile. So my scholarship condemns me? Hardly compelling, Inspector. Scholarship, Purbright replied, is neutral. Passion is not. You spoke of the Charter as the town's very soul. You wept for its loss, yet your grief was just a fraction too precise, like an actor hitting his mark. You did not fear the Charter's destruction. You feared what its presence would reveal? The historian rose abruptly, his chair scraping.
And what would that be, pray?
That your family's claim to the riverside is tainted, Purbright said, his voice soft but unwavering. Centuries ago, an ancestor swore an oath to maintain the land for public good. That oath was recorded in Clause 42. To proceed with the development, that clause had to disappear. If discovered, it would not merely block the project, it would expose a lineage of neglect and broken promises. In a town like Flaxborough, Doctor, the loss of reputation is a punishment far crueler than the law. Frobisher's breath came fast now, his mask cracking.
You cannot prove this.
The clause is gone, burned. Purbright held up a hand. Not entirely. A copy survives in the county archives.
You, of all people, should have remembered that.
This morning I requested a certified transcript. He laid a folded document on the table. The room seemed to lean toward it. Frobisher's face drained of colour. Your scheme, Purbright said gently, was clever.
You manipulated Mrs. Tither's fears, exploited Hardwick's ambitions, and let poor Tom Larch serve as the perfect scapegoat.
But like many clever plans, it failed to account for one thing: the human tendency to overplay perfection. The smudge of ink, the too selective fire, the too perfect explanation, each a note just slightly off-key. Mrs. Tither began to sob quietly. Hardwick muttered about betrayal and legal consequences. Tom Larch merely stared bewildered, as though someone had lifted a great weight from his shoulders without telling him why. Dr. Frobisher sank slowly back into his chair.
You speak of disgrace, he whispered.
Do you know what it is to bear the weight of centuries? To see one's name mocked, reduced to a byword for failure? Purbright's gaze was steady but not unkind.
I know that truth once hidden has a way of surfacing like a drowned man, Doctor.
And I know that it is better to face that truth with dignity than to bury it beneath lies. The room was silent. Even the ticking of the council chamber clock seemed to pause. Mayor Ordway cleared her throat, her voice tremulous.
What happens now, Inspector?
Purbright gathered his papers with deliberate care. That, he said, is for the law to decide.
My task is complete. As he rose, Frobisher covered his face with his hands.
Hardwick sat rigid, his earlier bluster evaporated. Mrs. Tither dabbed at her eyes, whispering apologies to no one in particular. Purbright walked to the door, his pace unhurried, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the chamber dissolved into murmurs and accusations, a cacophony of human voices struggling to rewrite their own parts in the story. He did not look back. The truth, once spoken, needed no audience. By the following week, the storm had passed. It had not vanished entirely on as storms rarely do, but it had moved on, leaving behind damp pavements, scattered debris, and townsfolk who preferred to speak of the weather. The newspapers reported the affair in clipped, cautious sentences, describing it as a regrettable misunderstanding regarding certain historical documents. There were no names mentioned, no lurid accounts of motives or methods. The public, it seemed, was to be spared both the full truth and the discomfort of knowing it. Readers nodded over their breakfast tables and turned the page to more pressing matters, like the price of fish or the football scores at the Grapes Inn. Conversation had shifted back to the safe, familiar rhythm of small complaints. There was a spirited debate over whether the new beer pump was inferior to the old one, and a heated argument about whose turn it was to replace the darts board, the charter, the fire, the meetings. These were mentioned only briefly, and always in lowered voices, as though the very air might carry them to unwelcome ears. Mrs. Tither returned to her shop within days, the damaged back room curtained off and the smell of smoke hidden beneath vigorous applications of lavender polish. She greeted customers with her usual fluttering enthusiasm, though her laugh now had a brittle edge. When someone hinted at the fire's cause, she deflected with exaggerated horror and a rapid change of subject. In time, people ceased to ask. They preferred, as ever, the comfort of appearance over the discomfort of truth. Councillor Hardwick resumed his routines with noisy determination. He spoke loudly at meetings, praised himself in speeches, and issued statements about the importance of transparency, all while ensuring that no one looked too closely at his accounts. His outburst during the final gathering was carefully reinterpreted as righteous indignation, and he allowed this version of events to solidify into public memory. As for Dr. Frobisher, his name vanished as thoroughly as if it had been blotted from the record. The Historical Society announced that he had taken an indefinite leave to pursue research elsewhere. No one asked where elsewhere might be, and no one mentioned the matter in his presence again. His house stood shuttered, the curtains drawn. On certain evenings a faint light could be seen flickering within, but whether it was occupied or merely settling into disuse was a question no one wished to answer. Tom Larch, newly absolved but not entirely freed, went about his work in subdued fashion. Though no official apology was offered, the absence of blame was itself a kind of pardon. People greeted him with awkward cheerfulness, speaking of weather and repairs while carefully avoiding the topic of vanished charters. In time, the gossip shifted elsewhere, and Tom slipped back into obscurity, which suited him well enough. Life in Flaxborough returned to its customary tempo. The market bustled on Saturdays, the church bells rang on Sundays, and the river flowed with the same indifferent murmur it always had. The scandal, once so consuming, became just another layer of silt beneath the surface, hidden but not gone. In the police station, Purbright sat at his desk beneath the steady glow of his lamp. Before him lay a mound of paperwork, forms and reports demanding the same quiet attention as weeds in a garden. He filled them in with his usual precise hand, pausing occasionally to sip his tea. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the task at hand, though now and then a flicker of thought passed across his face, like a cloud briefly dimming the sun. Sergeant Malley entered once or twice with updates on minor matters, a dispute over a boundary fence,
A missing bicycle, a scuffle outside the pub.
Each was received with the same calm nod. There was no mention of charters, fires, or historians. Those topics had already been filed away in the silent, unspoken archive that existed only in the minds of those who knew too much. As dusk settled outside the station windows, the lamps along High Street began to glow, casting soft reflections on the wet cobblestones. From his office, Purbright could hear the distant hum of the town, ordinary and unremarkable. It was the sound of lives continuing, of lies forgotten, of truths half-remembered and carefully ignored. He set down his pen and looked for a moment at the brass screw resting on his blotter, the last physical remnant of a plot now dissolved into silence. With a small, almost imperceptible sigh, he placed it in a drawer and closed it. Flaxborough would go on. Its people would speak of their neighbours' peccadilloes, their own virtues, and never, ever of Dr. Frobisher. And Purbright,
as always, would listen and choose quietly
which stories to believe and which to leave unspoken. The inspector returned to his forms, his face calm, his mind already moving past the case. Outside, the evening deepened, carrying away the last whispers of scandal. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.